Hi everyone, welcome to the February 28th edition of the TimeformUS Pacecast. I'm David Aragona here with my usual co-host Craig Molkowski, and we're looking back at last week's racing from across the country, though our focus will be Oaklawn Park's card last Saturday, where they did run their Derby Prep, the Grade 2 Rebel Stakes, 50 Kentucky Derby qualifying points on the line to the winner of that race, so Confidence Game, who was the victor, he is in the Kentucky Derby field if his connections want to go there. We'll talk about him and all of the other top contenders in the Rebel in just a little bit. Also on that Saturday card at Oaklawn was the Honeybee Stakes, a prep for the Kentucky Oaks. We'll discuss that one, along with a couple of other sprint races on that Saturday card, the Carousel and Allowance race that took place a bit earlier in the day. Over at Aqueduct, they ran the Stymie Stakes on Saturday. We'll talk about that one, along with a New York bred allowance race that received a notable speed figure a little bit earlier in the card. And then we'll head on over to Gulfstream Park, where they ran the Gulfstream Sprint on Saturday. Again, another notable non-stakes speed figure on that card from a maiden on the turf towards the end of the day. And we'll wrap things up with one race at the fairgrounds. But Craig, it's a pretty short rundown this week. Most of the racing world's eyes were trained on Oaklawn Saturday. Obviously, we were missing California with them canceling last week, so a bit of a condensed schedule to talk about from this past week.
Yeah, short is good with me. I don't mind not boring people too long, but I think the races we're going to talk about are some pretty high quality. We got some good performances, not just in the stakes races, but in some of the allowance and maidens as well.
And let's start with that Rebel Stakes at Oaklawn, because I think there's a lot to talk about in this race. First and foremost, the pace situation, because they were really moving up front, and I think that made the performances of some horses who finished off the board, like the fourth place finisher Verifying, maybe a little better than it might have seemed at the time. That horse did have some trouble furthermore at the top of the stretch that compromised his chances a little bit, but we'll get to them in the also-rans in just a bit. I would take nothing away from Confidence Game, Craig, who stepped forward with a big performance here, 117 TimeformUS speed figure. That is among the fastest that we've seen among any of the 3-year-olds so far in 2023.
It is. This was a pretty strong race, and as you said, a lot of it had to do with the pace. It was pretty obvious they were going quick when I think it was a 46-1 popped up on the screen. We just don't see that in route races very often in this country anymore, and it's not like Confidence Game was way off the pace, but things were really hot up front. He took full advantage. We saw a horse I know both of us liked, Red Route 1, who basically dropped off the screen. He was so far back you couldn't see him rally up for a decent second in here, but I do think some of that's the pace. When you look at the 2-3 finishers, they were both well back. So it was a race where you better bring your running shoes on if you were going to be around in the stretch.
Yeah, and I think that we have to give Confidence Game some credit, because as you said, it's not like he was that far off that extremely fast pace that really took its toll on the horses that were setting it. I think the good thing for Confidence Game with regard to his trip was that he was outside most of the way, and while he was losing a little bit of ground going wide, he avoided a lot of the trouble towards the inside that some of the horses that tried to save ground ended up having, because unsurprisingly, when there's so much speed in a race, the pace does start to come back a little bit in those long shots leaders. They were backing up at the quarter pole, and I think that caused some problems for horses that were trying to make their runs up the inside, and Confidence Game was able to avoid all of that trouble by staying out in the 3 and 4 path coming into the stretch. But I mean, he took over at the top of the lane, received some challenges late, particularly from the horse that you mentioned, Red Route 1, who was I think the chart has him 19 lengths back at the first call. As you said, he was off the screen and just far out of contention. He made a huge late run to get up for second, but he really did have the pace in his favor, and Confidence Game was still able to hold him off. So I don't want to view the winner's performance as some fluke, despite the fact that he was 18-1.
No, I don't either. And he's coming out of that Lecomte, which is turning into a pretty strong race. We saw Instant Coffee win that, but then we had Two Phils come back to run a good second next time out in the Risen Star. Dennington has already come back to win an allowance race. So the 2, 3, 4 finishers from that Lecomte have all come back to run well with improved speed figures.
And even prior to that, that allowance race that he participated in on November 26th at Churchill Downs, the winner of that race has 20 Kentucky Derby qualifying points, Rocket Can. He won the Holy Bull in his next start, and the fourth place finisher Hit Show came back and won the Withers. So that's been a very productive allowance race from late in the Churchill Downs meet last year. So Confidence Game was coming in here with some strong form lines, and there definitely was a case to be made for him here. I'm not going to redboard and say that I was a big fan of this horse coming in, but he definitely was one that probably was too big a price at 18-1, and he delivered. And just want to give a brief shout out to his trainer, Keith DeSormo, Craig, who it seems like he's always in this Triple Crown conversation, despite the fact that he's not spending the kind of money that the Brad Coxes and the Bob Baffert, their ownership groups do to get these Triple Crown candidates. I mean, he's spending under $100,000, often just five figures to get these horses, and Confidence Game actually is one of the better bred horses that he's had by Candy right out of a half-sister to Zenyana, but even he got that kind of pedigree for a pretty bargain price, and he just continues to get these horses to be factors in the Triple Crown.
Yeah, he always does seem to have one or two that aren't just there for fun. They come and bring their A game and show up. So he's one that, yeah, I think he's worth watching going forward. I think I saw that he's either going to come back at Oaklawn or maybe head to Louisiana, where he obviously ran last time in the Lecomte, and he's going to be pretty dangerous in either spot.
Let's talk about some of the also-rans, Craig. I know you already mentioned Red Route 1. It's just hard to get overly excited about a horse that just has such an utter lack of early speed. I mean, I know the Kentucky Derby is the kind of race where the pace can fall apart when they really go quickly up front, and we did see a horse take advantage of that kind of situation last year in Rich Strike, but I mean, this horse just leaves himself so much to do. I mean, he is the kind of runner that really would have to make that 20th to first run in the Derby if he's going to be successful there.
Yeah, it seems like maybe it would cost the horse some kick, but they got to try something to get this horse closer. Maybe blinkers, maybe a stronger rider that's just going to really get into him early, and maybe that wouldn't work out. But as you said, it worked last year in the Derby. It rarely works. It's not something that I would want to count on. But he is a runner with some quality, no doubt. I mean, that late run is always going to come. He's at least in the last three starts, I would say, he had trouble in the Kentucky Jockey Club. I know we had talked about that. He made a nice late run in the Southwest, though he was way too much to do to catch Arabian Night. So I think he's one to watch going forward, but I would try to change something personally.
Now, even though he lost this race in finishing third, I view the performance of Reincarnate, the former Bob Baffert, Tim Yakteen trainee. I think this horse actually rose in my estimation based on his performance here, because he had just a nightmarish trip. I mean, he's the kind of horse that had done his best running when he was forwardly placed in his starts coming in here. He was off a little bit slowly, so he put himself towards the back of the pack early, but a lot of horses would get discouraged in that situation. John Velasquez kind of had no choice but to put him on the rail and try to save some ground, and he was taking all sorts of kickback towards the inside. Looked for a brief moment on the far turn like he was going to get nothing, but when John Velasquez gave him a crack of the whip at the top of the stretch, he suddenly started running and just needed to find somewhere to go, and that proved to be a little bit of a difficulty as he got bumped pretty hard and sawed off in mid-stretch, but he was still coming on at the end to finish third, just beaten 2 lengths. I think this horse showed a lot of likable attributes in this third-place finish.
I agree. He showed some versatility. As I said, that's something we don't often see from a 3-year-old this early, where, I mean, he's a horse who's been right up on the lead and suddenly was towards the back of the pack, and often that's just not a good spot to be, but he made a good run. I'm not going to say he was better than the top two. I think he maybe would have been closer, but given the pace, maybe he would have been closer with Red Route 1. I do believe John Velasquez filed an objection that, in my opinion, that was never going to amount to anything, because there was no way it caused any change in the placing. And I'm not even sure he was the horse who was primarily responsible for the trouble.
No, I think the number 10 Bourbon Bash, who finished behind Reincarnate, was the one who caused his problems mid-stretch, and thankfully the stewards did not take that down. That was a pretty nice exacta if you had it. No, I disagree a little bit, Craig. I think Reincarnate, I view him as maybe the horse you want out of this race, and I think there's a scenario where he would have beaten this field if things had worked out a little bit better for him, though he can't break slowly in a race like the Kentucky Derby. That would be a real problem for him. But I think that he showed a lot more versatility, as you said, that I had seen from him in his prior starts, and there's real talent there. And before we move on from this race, Craig, I just do want to mention Verifying, who was the beaten favorite in this race. He's another one where I just don't think the trip really worked out. He was very close to those fast early fractions in third, and his rider, Florent Geroux, I don't want to be too hard on him because he had limited options breaking from the inside, and he did try to get this horse forward and save ground, but he was just following two horses that were coming to a stop, coming to the top of the stretch, and he had to wait, come around them, lost momentum doing that, and he was still running on a little bit at the end to finish fourth here, so I don't want to be too hard on him, although he is playing catch-up now from a point standpoint.
Right, and I agree with you. For Florent Geroux, I don't think he had a lot of options from the rail. He probably gave the ride I would have wanted. I know we talked about on the forecast, I said I was worried about him getting shuffled way back from that inside post, and he didn't do it, but, you can't have everything from the inside. Sometimes you don't get dealt the best hand, so I thought he ran fine from there. He actually improved his TimeformUS speed figure a few points, up to a 113, and I would expect better from him in next time out.
Yeah, and I've got to say, this race in particular, this past weekend, is the one that kind of has turned my outlook on this Kentucky Derby season. I was getting a little bit down on a few of the preps that we're seeing recently. There just hadn't been a whole lot to talk about. I mean, maybe there was one horse you wanted coming out of a lot of them, some lackluster speed figures, but this was a race where there was quite a bit to sink your teeth into, and I think that it really delivered. Even though there was a long shot winner, a lot of performances to talk about coming out of this race that are horses that could be interesting moving forward on this Kentucky Derby trail. So things are starting to get a little bit interesting as we're now about just over 2 months out from the first Saturday in May.
And the last horse I wanted to mention was Giant Mischief. I know you said you kind of doubted he would be a good two-turn horse, and I think that played out. I don't think he ran bad at all. He was up close to the hot pace, but he actually made a move what looked like he might be a winner, but he just kind of threw in the towel and had the look of a horse that probably would appreciate one turn and probably be pretty darn good at it.
I would agree with that. Let's move on to the Kentucky Oaks prep that they ran on Saturday at Oaklawn Park. Just before the Rebel, it was the Grade 3 Honeybee for the 3-year-old fillies, going the same 1.16 distance over the sloppy track. And Wet Paint Craig did it again, and she's now 3 for 3 on the dirt. All of those victories have come over wet track, so we do have to see if she can be as successful over fast going, but she really proved that she could overcome some things in this race. I mean, the pace was not nearly as fast as it was in the Rebel, and she was far back in the early going. She's not the horse that's the quickest out of the starting gate, so she's always going to leave herself with some ground to make up, but when she found some room in the lane, she kicked for home like a turf horse to run these horses down.
Yeah, I thought it was a good effort, despite what is a pretty lackluster speed figure, a 101. If she was a filly who had done that up near the front, like, tracking in second and third and then pulled away late, I would have more concerns about the number. But I'm not going to hold it against her too much. I think it was more a function of her running style and the pace, and I think it's actually a positive that she was actually able to win so easily, despite which wasn't much pace, and you can see the 2-3 finishers were the leader and the third place horse all the way around the track.
Yeah, it was not a pace that completely fell apart like in the Rebel. She was the only one that was making up that kind of ground from the back of the pack. And, I mean, you could see she was just loaded coming around the far turn. Flavian Pratt just had to find some room for her. And once he did, she really kicked. And I like that she was able to make her run coming through inside of horses, between horses. I mean, she's got a little bit of an ugly stride. She's got that paddling action that we sometimes see from progeny of sires like Blame and Candy Ride. And she, she's not the prettiest mover, but she covers a lot of ground, and the way she was kicking away from this field across the finish line is certainly encouraging for her getting added ground in the future, and just seems like the sort of work in progress that we might not have seen the best of just yet. Not sure that there are too many others to discuss from this honeybee, Craig. I mean, I did have a little bit of an opinion on the runner-up Condensation, who was able to hold on for second, and thankfully there was no inquiry, even though there was a little bit of bumping by her in the stretch. She was the runner-up here, but I mean, Grand Love, I think we're kind of learning about her that maybe 2 turns is not what she wants to do. I think they could turn her back in the future, but not too many others that I think are worthy of a mention beyond those top three.
No, I mean, even the second, third finishers weren't able to crack triple digits, and they were up close on a moderate pace. So I would definitely temper my enthusiasm about those.
The other stakes on Saturday at Oaklawn was the Carousel a little bit earlier in the day for the fillies and mare sprinters going 6 furlongs. And, Craig, we had seen Ugiri in a bunch of these Oaks preps last year, but I think she's proving now as a 4-year-old that she might be a better one-turn horse, because now she's 2 for 2 since coming off the layoff sprinting, and actually 3 for 3 sprinting in her career. And she beat a pretty good horse in here in Pretty Birdie, going out for a barn, Norm Cassie, whose horses have all been running at Oaklawn. So give Ugiri some extra credit for beating that foe.
Yeah, I was impressed by what I saw. I know when she had that comeback in late December, we didn't talk about it because that was when we were on a brief hiatus, I believe. But she came back, ran a really nice speed figure, and I kind of expected her to stretch back out just based on what we saw last year. She had won the fantasy before trying the Kentucky Oaks, but they kept her in a sprint race, and she ran great. She ran a 116 TimeformUS speed figure, a little bit higher than the 115 last time. She beat a very good sprinter in Pretty Birdie and beat her decisively. So she is one I would expect to see good things from, and she does have options, but as well as she's sprinting, you'd think they'd want to keep her there.
Yeah, I saw them reporting after the race that Rudy Brissett is considering the Grade 1 Madison at Keeneland going 7 furlongs, which seems like a perfect target at this time of year. You don't want to see them stretch her out immediately again, while they might want to try that in the future. She's having so much success sprinting right now that doesn't make a whole lot of sense to change up the formula at the moment. One more race to discuss from that Saturday card at Oaklawn was an allowance race a bit earlier in the day, won by Skelly. And Craig, we had talked about a couple of N2X allowance races that were part of the Pick 5 sequence on our forecast last week. This N1X allowance run earlier in the day featured some horses that were beaten by those that were competing in those allowance races later in the card, but this is the race that actually got the highest speed figure, as Skelly took a big step forward here. It just seemed like he absolutely loved the wet going.
Yeah, he looked really good in this effort. He ran a 117 TimeformUS speed figure. As you mentioned, there were 2 divisions of a non-winners of 2. He clearly ran faster. Now, I should address it was a sloppy track. Oftentimes that'll change throughout the day, but it didn't appear to be the case at Oaklawn. Oaklawn usually stays pretty consistent, and I think it did on Saturday. The speed figure, my worksheet, everything lined up and looked normal. There weren't really any tough decisions to make, so it wasn't like there were any breakouts on the card, and I just thought it was a good, strong effort from him. And yeah, maybe it was a slop, maybe not, because he ran pretty good last time. He had already had a pretty poor effort in the slop 2 back. So I just have a feeling he's a horse that's really come in hand for Steve Asmussen.
Yeah, Craig, I know we were engaging a little bit on Twitter on Saturday about sloppy and wet track handicapping and how sometimes I think some players try to oversimplify things a little bit when they look at horses' wet track records coming into days like this. And I think Skelly is a perfect example of a horse who maybe was a little underrated by the bettors because of his prior wet track form. And I would just say to people, if you're holding that December 10th wet track performance against him, you probably want to go and watch the trip, because he had about as disastrous a beginning of a race as you could possibly imagine for a front-running sprinter. He was probably cost about 3 or 4 lengths at the start and somehow ran past the entire field to get up to lead moving down the backstretch. I mean, he just had every excuse to finish as poorly as he did that day, and showed that probably wasn't a true indication of whether or not he likes a wet track. So often it pays off to do some digging on days like this, because what shows up in the career box in your daily racing form or TimeformUS PPs isn't always the most instructive as far as these horses' surface preferences.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I kind of mentioned on Twitter that tracks are maintained quite a bit differently than they used to be. I don't think wet track form is the factor that it used to be. I'm not saying it's non-existent. There are clearly a few horses that do like some moisture in the ground, but I just don't think it's as big of a factor.
All right, Craig, let's move on to New York and talk about the feature race at Aqueduct on Saturday. And all right, we're going to talk about Repo Rocks once again. Actually, well, the second time for me. I think you were off the week that we talked about his toboggan victory. I had Naira's Sarah El Badwi on that week, and I tried to be careful when I was talking about that one because I know a lot of people have some strong feelings about this horse's resurgence in form. But Repo Rocks didn't run the speed figure that he did too back when he got that 131 for his toboggan victory. Definitely a different kind of pace situation in this race, but once again, he was much the best in a stakes in New York.
Yeah, he was much the best, and I suspect his speed figure would have been a lot closer to that 131 last time if the race had more pace and he hadn't been bottled up the way he exploded through the stretch. He got a 121 in this spot. Not a whole lot to say about it. Everybody knows the reputation that Jamie Ness has. I believe he's only able to race right now because some of his violations are pending litigation. I don't know the whole deal. He's had a laundry list of them his whole career. So I will just say that I will view this horse with a healthy dose of skepticism.
Yeah, and it's not to say that Repo Rocks was never a talented horse. I mean, he had shown some promise in prior barns. He had first run some decent races for Tom Morley, but I mean, he's gone through a few different trainers since being claimed by this owner over a year ago. I mean, they first gave him to Juan Vasquez, who you probably have realized is no longer training horses, has been suspended from the game, and now he's with Jamie Ness. So, I mean, you could make of that what you will, but this horse just, for every barn change, just seems to keep on improving, and he's certainly better than ever right now. And I agree with you. He probably could have run a faster speed figure if the trip had worked out a little differently. Watching the race, I was kind of confused as to what Andrew Wolfson was trying to do, because this horse broke alertly and seemed like the lead was his for the taking, but he just seemed really intent on trying to get this horse off the pace. And I know that he's stated in the past that this horse seems to run his best when he can sort of get him in the pocket, but trying to get him in the pocket in this race turned into a little bit of an awkward endeavor. Finally got him there, and the horse was pretty keen in behind horses, and once he switched him out of the top of the stretch, I mean, he just accelerated like a turf horse to put these away. And I mean, the horses that finished behind him, Miles D, Farmo Power, Bourbonic, I think they all showed up and ran the races, and they're pretty decent horses, but just not in the same league as a runner like Repo Rocks, at least the version in the Jamie Ness barn right now.
Yeah, the others all ran fine, and it's a shame, I would say, that they have to deal with a horse like that. We'll see what happens in the future. I mean, I would imagine this is a horse that's going to point to a race like the Carter. I mean, why wouldn't you? And we'll have to deal with this situation all over again unless something changes.
Yeah, and I know, I mean, I don't want to keep talking about this too much, but I know Craig said it, and I think we just have to state that we understand why there's so much lack of patience and just growing weariness about these kind of results that don't seem to make a whole lot of sense on paper. We obviously saw the situation with trainers like Jason Service and Jorge Navarro, and again, we know nothing about the specific situation with Repo Rocks, but we saw trainers like that had these kind of results and the claiming level suddenly move up to the graded stakes top levels of the sport, and it was exposed what they were doing, and I think there's just a real lack of patience among the fans for potentially going through that all over again. So it's understandable why there was the kind of reaction that I saw on social media and other places to this kind of result. It's not like it's just the fans complaining for no good reason. We understand why there's that kind of sentiment about a result like this.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, at the end of the day, it's supposed to be horse racing, and it should mostly be about the horses. Obviously, the human connections are gonna have some part, and there's always gonna be some trainers better than others. But these inexplicable moves turn it into people racing, and frankly, I don't think a lot of people are interested in betting that.
Well, let's move on to another race on that Saturday card at Aqueduct. It was a New York Bred Allowance race for the fillies and mares, won by the Tom Morley-trained Granny's Connection. And Craig, this is a horse that I know you have a right to toot your own horn about a little bit because you took some liberties making her maiden breaking speed figure. That was a really difficult day at Aqueduct, and I know you were telling me you lose sleep about some of these Aqueduct speed figures because it seems like the track can change so much through the course of a day, and the day that Granny's Connection broke her maiden was a particularly difficult afternoon because it did seem like the track was changing quite a bit, and I know you didn't want to take the time at face value because it just didn't make sense for the horses in that field, and you gave her a pretty high speed figure for that performance, and she came back and more than repeated it here.
She did. I gave her a 112 that last time, and it was a day. It wasn't like that was the only race I rated with that same variant, but there were some pretty wild swings that day. But I felt pretty confident with as easily as she had won with another race right. I think it was the one couple right after. The track had just slowed considerably. They've all come back to run to the figures I gave them that day, and boy, did she run back to this one. She is just a really fast filly. She upped her figure to a 116 that time, and part of that's because of a pretty big pace boost because she just exploded out of the gate. She was about 5 on top after the first quarter mile and just kept right on going. She was eased up a little bit late, but just a really impressive performance. And she definitely seems like a horse ready for stakes races, particularly, is in the filly division.
Yeah, I remember when she made her debut back in the middle of December. Obviously, Maggie Wolfendale is married to Tom Morley, and she is the Naira Paddock analyst. And, just due to her personal bias, she doesn't often talk about her husband's horses in the paddock, just feeling like she's too close to them. But I remember she made a point to talk about this horse on debut and said, I don't think today is the day for her. She probably isn't quite ready, needs a start, but this is a horse that has shown us a high level of ability, so just keep that in mind. And she has really shown it in her second and third starts. Took a big step forward last time, and then in this race, once again, I mean, she was just in a different league than these N1X allowance horses she was facing on Saturday. It feels like the kind of horse that might have New York bred stakes in her future.
Yeah, for sure. And that race he came out of with the speed figure that was so hard to make, the horses who ran in behind her have all come back to run pretty well. A lot of them in the same race. They came back in a maiden race, which unfortunately had a timing problem, but I did time it from video, made the speed figure. The winner actually ran a 100 plus number, the runner up a 99. So it was looking like a pretty strong maiden race. And I think this one is Granny's Connection is pretty exciting anytime a horse has that kind of speed.
Let's move down to Florida, and we'll talk about a couple of races from Gulfstream Park. The feature there on Saturday was the Gulfstream Park Sprint. Craig, this is one we talked about in our DRF Stakes preview last week, and I know you selected the winner, Candyman Rocket, who was bet down to 7-5 favoritism, and understandably, Bill Mott has just been a terror with these sprinters as of late, and seems like he's got another pretty good one here, though Candyman Rocket would have a long way to go to catch up to some of Bill Mott's other top sprinters in this division. He certainly has a deep bench.
He does, and speed figure wise, he wouldn't really have that far to go. Now we saw Elite Power came back to win in Saudi with an impressive performance over Gunite, so he's obviously the leader of the division. I don't have an official speed figure, and it's not going to be an easy day to make one. I'm going to guess it's going to be about 122. I'll have that later today, and we'll put it out on social media. But it was a good effort by Candyman Rocket, no doubt. He ran, I think it was a career best speed figure, won pretty easily. The pace was pretty quick in the race. I know the figure is going to give him at least a few points boost. So good, strong effort from him. And he obviously had a couple of those big red layoff lines in our PPs lately. But he's run 2 in a row in pretty short order. So hopefully things are back on track because he looks like he could be a force.
Craig, I'm glad you brought up Elite Power winning in Saudi Arabia. We didn't even really talk about it. I just kind of assumed we didn't have to talk about those races. And obviously, with Elite Power being, I think, the only American-trained winner on that card, obviously, we know he's a good horse, having won the Breeders' Cup Sprint last year, but we don't often cover international racing on this podcast, and while there were some American horses competing there, it's just the kind of race card that I'm not sure what kind of implications it's going to have moving forward as far as these horses eclipse aspirations in 2023. Obviously, we'll see them come back to the U.S. hopefully at some point and compete in races here, so maybe we'll get a chance to talk about them then. But I know it wasn't a day that either you or I were looking to do an in-depth recap of.
No, I don't care what happens over there. I spent some time in Saudi Arabia, not my favorite place in the world, so I'll just leave it at that. I don't support those races.
Well, let's talk about one more race from Gulfstream Park on Saturday, and that was actually the last race of the day, a 3-year-old maiden special weight race won by a horse, Craig, that I know you and I were watching pretty closely, Carl Spackler. We had talked about his debut race where he had just narrowly lost to a fellow first-time starter, Far Bridge, about a month ago at Gulfstream Park, and that race had gotten a surprisingly high speed figure, not just from you, but I think it had gotten a 112 TimeformUS speed figure. It was just a very fast race on the day, almost inconceivably fast for that level. And we were interested to see if Carl Spackler, coming back for his second start, could validate that number. And I think he definitely did that.
Yeah, I don't think there's much doubt about that. He had run a 111, and I'm guessing he's going to get about a 112 for this effort. Again, I don't have it official. Turf's a little tricky on that day because some of the other races had much faster paces, so I think they might get the P designation. But when you win a turf race by almost 9 lengths, you were clearly superior, and he obviously ran a very good and very fast race.
Yeah, this is a horse with a ton of talent, and clearly this wasn't the deepest maiden field you're ever going to see. There wasn't that much quality behind him, but still, it's rare to see horses win turf races by nearly 10 lengths. I mean, he was 8 3/4 lengths ahead at the finish and going away. I mean, when Jose Ortiz pushed the button, this horse just instantly put distance between himself and the rest of the field. He is a horse of serious quality, and I mean, it's rare to see turf horses at this time of the year earning speed figures that are faster than a lot of Derby prep horses are running off the dirt right now. So I think Carl Spackler and Far Bridge, that Christophe Clement trainee, are horses to get pretty excited about for some graded stakes that we're going to see later in the year. Hopefully they can both stay healthy. I saw that Far Bridge was not entered in the stakes at Gulfstream on Saturday, so maybe they have a different target or they're giving him some more time, but he has been working out since that debut race, so hopefully we do get to see these horses match up again, likely in a graded stakes down the line.
Yeah, and just to put the speed figures in some perspective, that's often on turf the kind of numbers we see winning races in like the New York Turf Series in July and August at Belmont and Saratoga. So to do that in just January and February is not something we're going to see very often.
Let's close things out on the podcast this week with one more 3-year-old performance. That was from a Saturday allowance race at Fairgrounds. Invulnerable, a horse who had been pretty game when he won his debut sprinting at Churchill Downs last year, had been stretched out in his last couple of starts. Maybe didn't get the best ride, especially in his prior race at Fairgrounds, but they cut him back to sprinting here, Craig, and I think this horse is proving he just wants to go shorter.
Yeah, this was a race when I sat down to do the figures. I kind of had to pop it open and see who the heck it was that was running this big number. It seemed like a pretty nondescript allowance race coming in, but Invulnerable ran a big one. He's getting a 113 TimeformUS speed figure, and he looked very good doing it. He came out of that race determinedly was in. We already talked about that allowance race, I believe. We did at one point when he beat Tappett's Conquest, but yeah, just a very good effort from him. Certainly seems like 2 turns wasn't for him. The one note I will make, and maybe it had something to do with the speed figures, it did seem like it was a pretty speed favoring track at the fairgrounds on Saturday. I'll have to write our buddy Marcus and ask him what he thinks about that.
Yeah, it was kind of crazy to me that Invulnerable was rated in that 2-turn determinedly allowance race. You probably remember determinedly went wire to wire there, and they were intent on getting Invulnerable off the pace in that race. When you're trying to stretch out a sprinter with speed, I have no idea why you're rating them to try to do so, but they allowed Invulnerable to show his speed in this 6-furlong race, and he clearly has plenty of it, as that 113 TimeformUS speed figure would make him competitive in stakes moving forward. And also want to give a shout out to the runner-up Gilcrease, horse who came back off a long layoff to be second here. We had only seen him once before in a turf race at Saratoga last year when he made his career debut, and they switched him over to dirt for his second start for trainer Al Stahl, and shows, I think, that he can run on both surfaces. So both of these top two might be horses with some talent.
I'm glad you mentioned him because he ran a 108 speed figure himself, looked pretty good doing it off of the bench. And the horse that was back in third actually went off the second choice, is a pretty good Brad Cox horse, Distorted Pro. He's very consistent, if nothing else. He has run basically high 90 speed figures in every start. So he was a pretty good baseline to use when making the race figure.
Well, Craig, that's all the races to recap on the podcast this week, but there's a lot to look forward to this upcoming weekend, especially on Saturday, with 3 Derby preps taking place across the country. The Fountain of Youth at Gulfstream, the San Felipe out in California. Both of those races are drawn already. The Gotham will be drawn on Wednesday. So we're going to learn a lot more about who's going to be in the Kentucky Derby field on Saturday, as the winners of all of those races getting 50 points. They will have berths in the Kentucky Derby. And I think we're going to be talking about the Gulfstream sequence on our forecast a little bit later in the week. That's an all-stakes sequence that culminates with the Fountain of Youth. So a lot to look forward to this upcoming weekend.
Yeah, I would say this is the first true big weekend we've had on the Derby Trail. I'd say we have 3 different races, and the points keep increasing. This is almost like round 2. We've had the early preps. Now this is the second level, and it's hard to believe, but there's basically only one more round at all the tracks after this, where it'll be the 100-point races. So time flies, man. The Derby is coming up on us quick, and I know you mentioned a horse who was behind the 8-ball points-wise. It's getting to be that time where you better run well or you're not going to have a shot in the Derby.
Yeah, that horse Verifying probably just has one more chance to get those points, and that's going to be the case for a lot of horses. It's crunch time. If they're going to show something, now is the time to do it. So we'll be interested to see what transpires in those preps on Saturday. And as I said, Craig and I are going to talk a little bit more, especially about those Gulfstream races a little bit later in the week. Everybody, thanks for tuning into the Pacecast this week. Remember, you can always catch these TimeformUS podcasts on DRF.com, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. Just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Again, thanks for listening, and make sure to catch that TimeformUS forecast coming up later in the week.